Texas, 1881. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty auction yard where cattle bawled and men bartered over hides, horns, and hooves. Among the noise and motion stood Everett Malone, a rancher known for saying little and asking for less. He had come for feed, perhaps a mule if the price was right. What he hadn't expected was the girl. She was bound by a coarse rope at the wrist, standing beside a broken-down mule with ribs sharp enough to slice through the air. Her eyes scanned the crowd, unreadable yet piercing, as though listening with more than her ears. Beside her swayed a man reeking of whiskey and sweat, holding the rope like a leash. "She don't speak," the man slurred to the gathering onlookers. "Don't hear neither." "But she works." Laughter bubbled from the crowd, ugly and loud. Everett said nothing. He just watched. The girl looked no older than 19, her cheeks flushed from heat or shame or both, her lips pressed tight. When her eyes locked with Everett's, something in him shifted. She didn't look afraid. She looked like she'd seen every cruelty a man could offer and had chosen not to flinch. That look, quiet, steady, was what made Everett raise his hand. The bidding was pitiful. A few chuckles, some half-hearted offers. The girl and the mule went for less than a pair of boots. Everett handed over the money, took the rope, and with a single nod turned and walked toward his wagon. She followed, not needing to be pulled. They rode in silence, dust curling behind the wheels, until the town vanished behind them and the dry hills swallowed the road. At the ranch, nestled between two rocky ridgelines, Everett showed her to a small shed once used for sheep. "It's yours now," he said simply. She nodded, still silent, and went inside. The next morning, before he could light the stove, she was already outside hauling water from the well. By midday, she'd mucked the stalls, stacked kindling, and mended a tear in the chicken wire. She moved with quiet certainty, like someone who'd learned to anticipate what needed doing. He asked her name that evening. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached into her apron and pulled out a scrap of paper. On it, in small, careful script, Clara. That was all. No surname, no explanation, just Clara. Everett nodded once. "All right, Clara." That night, he found himself listening for her movements, half expecting her to vanish into the hills. But she stayed. Days stretched into weeks. Clara rose before dawn, worked beside him without being asked, and never once complained. She never sang, never laughed, but her presence filled the place more than any voice could have. Everett noticed things. She would pause in her work just before the first signs of a storm. Eyes tilted to the wind like she could feel the weather coming in her bones. She could calm a spooked colt with one hand on its nose. She never flinched at gunfire or thunder. She noticed when the chickens began laying less and when the creek turned slightly cloudy upstream, signaling runoff. She may not have heard the world, but she understood it better than most. Everett began to speak more than he was used to, not because she asked, but because she listened. He'd talk while mending fence posts or feeding cattle, telling stories about his late brother, about the war, about the way the stars used to look before the railroad came. Clara never interrupted, but she always looked directly at him, eyes soft, present. One morning, she handed him a cup of coffee and pointed toward the eastern hill, then drew a circle in the air with her finger. Coyotes, probably. Sure enough, they found a young calf that hadn't made it, claw marks along its flanks. Everett started to trust her instincts more than his own. Then came the whispers. It started with the feed store clerk asking why Everett kept a mute girl out on his property. Then the mailman asked if Everett was harboring some kind of witch. Word spread fast in a small town, especially when folks had nothing better to do. One afternoon, Everett and Clara rode into town for supplies, and people parted like the sea. Murmurs followed them. A boy hissed, "She's cursed," and his mother shushed him too late. Clara didn't react, but Everett's jaw tightened. That night, she didn't come to supper. He found her behind the barn, sitting in the hay. Her hands balled into fists. He sat beside her, neither of them speaking. After a long while, he said, You don't have to prove anything to them. She glanced at him, eyes glistening. He continued, You don't have to say a word to be the best person I've ever known. Trouble came a week later. 5 men rode in with their preacher in tow, demanding Everett send the girl away. She brings omens, one of them said. We've had 3 miscarriages in 2 weeks. Everett stood in the doorway, hand resting near his rifle. That's not Clara's fault, he said evenly. She's not deaf either, another man added. My boy said she looked right at him when he whispered. Everett didn't flinch. So she hears, and maybe she doesn't. Doesn't matter. She's not yours to judge. The preacher stepped forward. She's unnatural. Everett looked past them, saw Clara standing by the barn with her chin lifted. She's the most natural person I've ever met. She listens better than any of you. The crowd wavered. After a tense pause, they turned and left, muttering. Clara didn't thank him. She didn't have to. Her eyes told him everything. Life returned to its rhythm. Autumn came. Then frost. Clara began to hum not songs with words, but quiet melodies that soothed animals and men alike. Everett found himself leaving notes on the kitchen table. She responded in kind. One day, she brought him a carved piece of wood, shaped like a hawk. He asked why. She wrote, because you see everything but never boast. They began to share tea in the evenings, hands occasionally brushing. And when they sat together on the porch, silence no longer felt empty. It felt sacred. One winter morning, Everett fell from his horse and cracked a rib. Clara cared for him with hands gentle but sure. She rubbed salve into his side and fed him broth without comment. When he tried to thank her, she pressed a hand to his chest and smiled. Later that week, she handed him a folded note. In her precise handwriting, I do hear you. He stared at it for a long time before answering, and I've never felt more heard. Years passed. The town changed. People softened. Clara helped a neighbor's child recover from a fever using nothing but willow bark and warm compresses. She showed others how to watch animals closely, how to read signs in the land. Folks began coming to her for help. They called her the girl who hears the wind. Children ran to hug her skirts. She never said much, but always knew what needed saying. Everett and Clara never married in the eyes of the church. But theirs was a union truer than paper could bear. She wore a ring he carved from cedar, and they built a life of quiet devotion. Each night they sat by the fire, sharing stories with hands and glances. And when storms came, they faced them together, no words needed. And so they grew old in the silence they had made sacred, 2 people who had found in each other not only peace but recognition. He had bought a girl the world discarded. She had given him back his heart. Neither of them ever said the word love out loud. They never needed to. The sun was beginning to dip low behind the cottonwoods when Everett Malone hitched the reins and turned his wagon northward, the girl and the exhausted mule in tow. She hadn't spoken a word since he untied the rope from her wrist and draped it loosely across her lap. She sat rigid on the bench beside him, her palms pressed to her knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. Her clothes were thin, dusty, and patched, offering little protection from the wind that swept down from the canyon. The old mule limped along behind the wagon, ribs protruding like bent slats under a torn tarp. Everett said nothing. Words seemed useless. He had bought livestock with more dignity than what that drunk man had shown. But there had been something about the girl, something in the way she met Everett's eyes, not with desperation, but with quiet resolve that made him pull $2 silver from his pocket without a word and settle the deal. They reached the ranch late. It was a quiet place tucked into a shallow valley at the edge of scrubland, where the hills rolled into each other like sleeping animals. The house was modest, weathered wood and stone, with smoke curling from the chimney and the creak of a windmill spinning on rusted bearings. He gestured for her to follow as he lifted the saddle from the mule's back and turned it loose into the lower paddock. She stepped down from the wagon without assistance and followed him to the barn. He paused by the door of the old sheep shed and pushed it open with one boot. The interior was empty but dry, lined with straw and a single wool blanket folded over a wooden crate. "It ain't much," Everett said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but it's yours if you want it." She nodded once, eyes never leaving his. The next morning, before the sky had fully lightened, she was already outside hauling water with 2 dented buckets swinging from a yoke balanced across her shoulders. Everett watched from the kitchen window, his coffee cooling in his hand. She moved like someone used to labor, used to being unnoticed. By the time he stepped outside, she'd already stacked kindling, fed the chickens, and was kneeling by a busted fence rail with a length of twine and a mallet in hand. He approached slowly, unsure of what to say. She looked up at him, her face neither cold nor warm, and held out a small scrap of parchment pulled from her apron. Scrawled in precise looping script was a single name, Lark. He read it once. Then again. "All right then," he said, tucking the parchment into his vest pocket. "Lark it is." She nodded, then returned to her task. From that moment on, the days found rhythm. Lark worked beside him without prompting. She swept the porch, milked the goats, turned soil in the neglected vegetable patch, and never asked for anything. She didn't speak. Not once. But her silence didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate. She communicated in small gestures, a raised brow, a quick flick of her wrist, a glance that told more than paragraphs ever could. Everett began to talk more than usual, not because he expected replies, but because she listened differently than others. She listened with her entire being. One evening, he told her about his mother, who used to bake honey bread on Sundays. Another evening, about the barn cat he'd lost last winter. She never interrupted, never offered a nod of pity, but sometimes she would pause, mid-stir at the stew pot or halfway through patching a quilt, and look up at him in a way that made him feel less alone. He found himself checking the horizon less often, found the quiet of the house no longer suffocating. It became clear early on that Lark knew more than most gave her credit for. She seemed to feel weather shifts before they came, pointing to the sky or shaking her head just before a storm rolled in. She noticed things: a split hoof, a sick hen, the small drift of termites beneath the porch boards before anyone else would have. Her awareness was constant, sharp. Everett began to rely on it. One day, she tugged gently on his sleeve and pointed to the cattle. 2 were lying off to the side, heads low. By nightfall, they had both calved 2 healthy heifers. No complications. He gave her a small nod of thanks. She simply returned to gathering kindling like it was nothing at all. The townsfolk took notice eventually, the girl who never spoke but seemed to always know. Whispers started, as they always do. Some said she was a blessing, others a curse. A woman at the mercantile muttered about unnatural quiet. A boy at the blacksmith said she looked right at him when he mumbled under his breath. Everett ignored it. What did they know? They hadn't seen her gently ease a dying lamb into its final breath, or coax a child back from a fever with cool cloths and soft, humming sounds that barely rose above the wind. Then, one dusky evening, she saved him. He had gone into the ravine to fetch a wagon wheel caught on a tree root. The sun had slipped lower than expected. The rocks were slick from snowmelt, and his foot gave way. He fell hard, the impact snapping pain through his ribs and jolting the air from his lungs. By the time Lark found him, he was halfway conscious, slumped over a mossy boulder. She didn't panic. She knelt beside him, checked his limbs with careful hands, and fashioned a crude sling from her shawl. Somehow, with nothing more than sheer will, she got him to the wagon and back home. He awoke in his bed, pain slicing his side, and found her sitting nearby, a bowl of soup cooling on the table. She lifted a spoon to his mouth. He winced. "Don't fuss over me," he muttered. She raised an eyebrow, not unkindly, then offered the spoon again. He took it this time. She didn't leave his side for 3 days. When the worst had passed, he found a note on the nightstand. Her handwriting, tidy and even I am not broken. He read it over and over, then wrote beneath it, "Neither am I." From that day, something shifted between them. They still didn't speak, not out loud, but began writing back and forth in a shared notebook, sometimes just a word, sometimes a whole page. Everett began to wait for her notes the way he once waited for spring. One day she drew a hawk soaring above a canyon. Beneath it, she wrote, "This is how you see the world." He traced the lines with his thumb and didn't know how to answer. By the first snowfall, their days had formed a quiet symphony, mornings with coffee and shared glances, afternoons of work done side by side, evenings reading the same book, Lark's fingers moving softly over the page as Everett read aloud. She never repeated a word, but somehow, he knew she heard him not with ears but in a deeper way, in the way she leaned closer when he faltered, in the way she paused when a word struck something tender. He gave her a ring carved from hickory wood one day, left on the railing outside her shed. The next morning, she wore it on a chain around her neck. They never spoke vows, never needed to. What they had couldn't be boxed into a ceremony or measured by papers. They simply were, a man and a woman who had found in each other something whole, something quiet, something worth protecting. And so the seasons passed, and the ranch became more than land and timber. It became a home, not built from stone or silence, but from the kind of understanding that doesn't need to be spoken. Lark remained the girl who said nothing but heard everything, and Everett, the man who once needed no one, now waited each morning for the sight of her moving through the mist like a promise. The morning air still clung to frost when Caleb Dwyer stepped out of the barn, his breath hanging like smoke. Across the paddock, near the woodpile, Miriam was already working, splitting logs with steady hands and a rhythm that matched the creak of the windmill above. She moved with a kind of quiet resolve, her boots crunching the half-frozen soil, her eyes tracking the sky in that way she always did, measuring something unseen. Caleb leaned against the post and watched. She'd been there 3 weeks now, and though not a single word had passed between them, the silence no longer felt empty. It had taken on weight, like a language of its own, made from glances and movements, shared tasks and unspoken understandings. Miriam had never claimed a room in the house. She slept in the bunkhouse near the goats. Though he told her the spare room was warmer, she just nodded and stayed where she was. Every morning she rose before dawn and moved through her chores with such efficiency that Caleb often found himself standing aside, tools in hand, just watching. She fed the hens with careful portions, turned the compost with purpose, wiped the sweat from the horses before the salt crusted. She didn't guess what needed doing. She knew. The first time she touched the old dog's hip, where the bone pressed through too thin fur, he watched her eyes flick to the right rear hoof. The dog whimpered, son, and she simply nodded, rubbed gently. The next day she boiled willow bark and dabbed it into the dog's feed. By the week's end, he was limping less. She startled him with that awareness more than once. When the sky was blue and the wind still, she set sandbags by the barn door. Later that night, a fast spring storm rolled in from the north, rattling the windows and flooding the dry creek beds. Another morning, she paused while mucking the stalls, looked over her shoulder toward the pasture, and dropped the rake. She took off running. Caleb followed her instinctively and found the youngest calf lying flat, froth at its mouth, eyes wild. Without speaking, she pressed her hands to its ribs, then to its neck, then wrapped her shawl around its middle and lifted its chin. Caleb fetched the tincture of molasses and vinegar, and together they coaxed the calf back from the edge. The ranch had never run better. For all her silence, Miriam had brought with her a stillness that calmed not just the animals, but the land itself. Caleb found the fences needed mending less often. The horses responded more quickly. The goats gave sweeter milk. Even the windmill stopped groaning as loudly. Or maybe he just heard it differently now. Some evenings, he caught her standing on the edge of the hill behind the smokehouse, her face turned toward the sky. She wasn't watching the sunset, she was listening. Somehow, feeling what was coming in the wind, he never interrupted her then. One afternoon, He came back from town to find the kitchen scrubbed clean, fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, and a note on the counter, "The mare is close." Sure enough, when he ran out to the stable and the black mare was pacing, sweating, her flanks twitching, Miriam stood by with a bucket of warm water and fresh linen, calm as ever. The foal came fast, but not easy. When it was done, she sat back on her heels, arms streaked with blood and hay, and looked at him with that same measured stillness. He didn't know what to say, so he handed her a clean towel and poured 2 mugs of coffee. They drank in silence while the foal took its first shaky steps. Caleb had started talking to her at some point, not expecting answers, just filling the space. He told her about the time he'd been kicked by a mule and laid up for a month with no one but a half-blind rooster for company. He told her about his brother dying in the war, about how the house had never felt right after their mother passed. He talked about the droughts, about the time a hawk nested in the eaves, about the lightning strike that had burned down the old sugar barn. Sometimes she would nod, sometimes she would look at him a little longer than usual, but mostly she just listened, and he found himself saying more than he ever had before. Then there was the night the youngest goat started crying, a thin, almost human wail that echoed through the dark. Caleb jumped from his bed, rifle in hand, thinking it was coyotes, but Miriam was already there in the barn, holding the kid in her lap, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. The animal's belly was swollen, and its eyes rolled white. Miriam didn't panic. She moved her fingers along its spine, pressed a cloth to its gums, and let it rest against her chest. By dawn, the kid was breathing steady. Caleb stood in the doorway, unable to look away. She hadn't needed any light. She'd just known. They fell into a rhythm: sunlight, soil, sweat, and supper. He noticed the small things she did that made life easier without asking: stitching his gloves when they split, sharpening the scythe before he remembered to, setting the kettle near the hearth so the tea would be ready by the time he came inside. She once left a flower on the table after a hard week. No note, just a single wild iris in a chipped jar, leaning toward the window. The gesture sat with him for days. People in town started asking about her. He didn't tell them much, just that she helped around the place, that she was quiet, that she earned her keep. When the storekeeper pressed, he only said, "She listens better than most of us talk." He didn't say how she seemed to see straight through a man's ache, didn't say how she had once pulled a splinter from his palm and paused before bandaging it, as if sensing the pain didn't come from the wood at all. She still hadn't spoken, but one day, after they mended the east fence together, she handed him a small tin box. Inside was a stack of worn paper slips. On the top, her handwriting, neat and even, said, "I don't speak because I don't need to prove I'm worth hearing." Caleb stared at it for a long time before replying. He found a pencil, flipped the page over, and wrote, "I hear you just fine." She smiled, then small but real, and tucked the note back into the box like it was a secret worth keeping. Seasons passed. The ranch kept thriving. The cattle were fat, the fields full. Children from neighboring farms came to see the animals, and somehow they always found their way to Miriam. She'd show them how to hold a chick, how to feel the hum of a horse's breath, how to recognize when the wind was going to shift. They followed her like she was something sacred. Caleb didn't mind. He liked watching her with them, liked knowing he wasn't the only one who saw the quiet miracle she was. The nights grew longer, the days shorter. The silence between them never broke, but it deepened, thickened into something warm. They shared tea on the porch, wrapped in quilts, shared glances when the stew turned out just right, shared the work, the weight, and the worth of the land. And when the first snow came, light as ash on the rooftops, Miriam stood in the center of the field, hands outstretched, letting the flakes gather on her palms. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching her. And for the first time in years, he felt the cold not as loneliness, but as peace. They never put it into words. They didn't need to. What they had spoke louder in silence than any vow ever could. And the ranch, once filled with the hollow echoes of years gone by, was now full of life. of rhythm, and of a love that required no sound to be heard. The wind shifted the moment Miriam walked into the mercantile. Caleb Dwyer stood beside her, scanning the shelf for nails and feed. But he could feel the room shift even before the door finished closing. The shopkeeper, usually full of idle chatter, offered only a stiff nod. The other customers fell unusually silent. A woman with a sack of flour in hand glanced at Miriam, then quickly looked away, whispering something under her breath to the man beside her. Miriam stood still, hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes low but unafraid. She didn't flinch when a boy tugged at his mother's skirt and hissed, "That's her!" The mother grabbed the boy's shoulder and turned him, but it was too late. The words had landed, back at the ranch. Caleb sat on the porch with the bag of feed untouched beside him, turning over the moments in his mind. Miriam worked in the garden, plucking weeds with slow, deliberate movements. He watched the way she moved, how each motion seemed to belong to the earth itself. He had no name for what she did, how she knew when a calf would be born early or when a snake lay coiled beneath the haystack. But he knew what people called it when they didn't understand. He had heard it before, words like unnatural, touched, cursed. It began with small things. A neighbor's child took ill. And though the fever broke in days, the mother whispered that Miriam had passed too close to the boy the day before. A wagon wheel cracked downriver, and the owner claimed it was because Miriam had looked at him without blinking. Then came the cattle. One morning, 3 head from a neighboring ranch turned up dead in the field, bellies bloated, tongues blackened. No one knew what caused it, but by sunset, Caleb overheard 2 men in town say, "It started after that girl arrived." One of them spat in the dirt and crossed himself. Whispers became talk. Talk became warnings. Caleb kept to himself more. He rode into town only when necessary, always with Miriam beside him, always silent but upright. She never asked what they said. She didn't need to. She saw it in the way children stepped behind their mothers, the way men set down tools when she passed. But still, she continued her work as if untouched, as if the world around her didn't tremble with suspicion. She baked bread, trimmed hooves, stitched worn sleeves, and stayed up late by the fire making tinctures for the livestock. Every morning she rose before dawn, and every evening she folded her apron with care and hung it on the same nail by the stove. Then came the day the storm broke not in the sky, but in the valley. It was a Sunday afternoon, the sun high and heavy. Caleb was mending a saddle strap when he heard the sound hooves, many of them. He stepped out to see dust rising from the ridge. A group of riders came into view, 8 men, maybe more, with rifles slung and purpose in their eyes. At the front rode Thorne, a man with more land than sense, flanked by a preacher in a black coat and stern eyes. Caleb didn't move from the porch. Miriam stood just inside the doorway, her figure still in the shadow behind him. "Dwyer," Thorne called, pulling up his horse. "We need to talk." Caleb stepped off the porch. "You brought a lot of company for a conversation." "We came as neighbors," the preacher added, dismounting. "And as men of faith." Caleb crossed his arms. "What is it you want?" The preacher looked past him toward the door. "It's about the girl, the one you've kept out here, away from decent folk. She's done nothing to harm anyone." "Nothing," Thorne scoffed. "Livestock dying, crops failing, children waking with night terrors, and always after she's been near." Caleb narrowed his eyes. "That's not proof." The preacher stepped closer. "It's not proof we need, it's peace. People are scared of what she might be. She's a woman who works harder than any man I've known. She doesn't speak. She watches people, knows things before they happen. That's not right. She's not some creature. She's a person." The preacher lowered his voice. "Caleb, we've all seen what happens when signs go ignored. You keep her here, and whatever follows, blood, fire, sickness, it's on your head." For a long moment, no one spoke. Miriam stepped forward into the sunlight then, her hands at her sides, eyes steady. She looked not at the men, but at Caleb. He turned, met her gaze, and something passed between them, a quiet decision. "You want to drag her out of here," Caleb said, turning back to the crowd. "You'd better be ready to go through me." There was a murmur. One of the men shifted in his saddle. Another looked away. The preacher frowned. "This isn't a threat, it's a warning." "And here's mine," Caleb replied. "You step foot on this land again with anything less than kindness, and you'll see what real danger looks like." They didn't come inside. They didn't try to take her. But the message was clear. As they rode off, dust curling behind them like smoke, Miriam reached out and gently touched Caleb's arm. He turned to her, saw the question in her eyes, and said only, "You're safe here." That night, the wind picked up, and a light rain fell. Caleb sat by the fire, running a whetstone over his blade, the steel glinting with each pass. Miriam sat at the table, writing in the notebook they shared. When she was done, she slid it across to him. Her handwriting, neat and unshaken, read, "I won't run. I've been running too long." He picked up the pencil and wrote beneath it, "Then we'll stand." They didn't speak of it again, but something shifted. The ranch no longer felt just like a place of work or shelter. It felt claimed, bound by something stronger than ownership, older than law. And though they knew the town might never fully forget, never fully forgive, they also knew this: the fear others carried was not their burden to shoulder. They had each other, and in that, there was strength no crowd could unravel. The dust had barely settled after the riders disappeared down the ridge when Miriam stepped off the porch and walked past the paddocks without a word. Caleb watched her from the barn, straw in his hands, unsure if following her would help or only push her deeper into whatever thoughts she was carrying. The confrontation with the townsfolk still rang in his bones, every accusation, every wary glance, every ounce of heat that burned beneath their supposed righteousness. But Miriam had stood there, solid and calm, never shrinking from them, and now she was alone by the grove, standing beneath the oak tree that twisted its limbs like arms reaching skyward. The wind rustled its leaves and carried her scent back toward the house rosemary, leather, and a faint sweetness like warm hay. He walked slowly, letting his boots crunch just enough to let her know he was coming. She didn't turn, not at first, but when he stepped beside her, she looked up and met his gaze with eyes that carried the weight of everything she hadn't said. For a moment, neither spoke. The breeze softened, and the sun sank lower, casting their shadows long across the field. Caleb cleared his throat, then said, "They don't understand." She didn't respond, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. He looked at her hands, strong hands, scarred in places, the fingers stained from working soil and herbs. And he remembered how those hands had once calmed a panicked mare just by resting on her neck, how they'd closed his coat buttons when his hands shook too much from fever, how they'd written notes to him when he needed silence more than sound. He stepped back, took a breath, and said something he hadn't said out loud to anyone. "I spent most of my life not being seen." Not really. People saw the ranch, the work I could do, the money I might have, but not me. He looked out toward the hills, then back at her. "But you, since the day you arrived, you looked straight through all of that. You heard me before I said anything, and I didn't know how badly I needed that until it happened." Miriam blinked, once, then twice. She lowered her eyes, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw her swallow hard, like holding back something too big to carry alone. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out their shared notebook. She flipped to the last page and wrote a single word: "Stay." He stared at the question, and something inside him cracked open. He took the pencil from her hand, and in large, uneven script, wrote "always." They stood there until the sun vanished behind the hills, until the wind died and the crickets began to sing. When they returned to the house, everything had changed. Though no new walls had gone up, no vows had been spoken, but something deeper had passed between them. From that moment on, they moved not just in rhythm but in step with one another. If she rose early to tend the garden, he was already pouring coffee. If he patched a fence post, she was there with wire before he could ask. They began to leave small things for each other, fresh sprigs of mint on the windowsill, carved tokens of wood, pressed flowers hidden inside book. No grand gestures, no declarations, just quiet offerings, each one saying, "I see you," and the town, as small towns often do, forgot slowly. Or rather, it grew tired of fear. The preacher who had once led the charge found himself needing Miriam's help. When his youngest daughter broke out in boils no doctor could ease, she gave him balm made of honey and lavender, and never asked for thanks. A boy who'd once run from her came back with a twisted ankle and limped home stronger. One by one, the same mouths that had cursed her began to fall silent. They didn't apologize, not directly, but their distance shrank. People nodded when they passed her in the mercantile. Someone left a pie at their doorstep during the harvest festival. There was still wariness, but not malice. That was enough. The bond between Caleb and Miriam deepened in the spaces where words might have once lived. In winter, when the fire popped and crackled and the snow climbed up the windows, they'd sit across from each other with books in hand, passing notes back and forth like school children. In spring, they'd plant side by side, their hands deep in the soil, their movements silent but synchronized. When summer brought its long, hot days, they'd rest in the shade beneath the old oak, and sometimes he'd hum a tune while she wove dried stems into something beautiful and strange. He never asked her to explain her past. She never asked him to fix his. They met where they were, with the scars they carried and the silence they shared, and it was enough. One evening, after a long day mending the southern fence line, Miriam handed him a folded note that read, "You don't fill the silence, you make it safe." He pressed it to his chest and held it there long after she'd turned away. Years passed. The ranch grew stronger. The land flourished under their care. The house slowly filled with tokens of a life quietly but fully lived, baskets she'd woven from river reeds, coats he'd stitched for her when the first frost came early. Jars of preserved peaches lined neatly on the shelf. The windmill creaked less, as if it too had settled into peace. They never used the word love, not out loud, but it pulsed through everything, in the way he brushed the hair from her eyes when she slept on the porch, in the way she'd lean into his side after supper, resting her head on his shoulder for just a moment before rising to clean, in the way they shared the notebook even after they could read each other's thoughts without needing a single word. One late autumn night, when the stars burned cold and bright above the ridge, Caleb sat beside the hearth, the notebook in his lap. Miriam was in the kitchen, humming softly as she dried the last dish. He flipped through the pages past recipes, drawings, poems, and short lines they'd scribbled to each other over the years. He stopped on the first page, the one where she had written her name in clean, deliberate strokes, Miriam. Below it, in his own hand, he had once written "safe here." He smiled, then turned to a fresh page. Carefully, he wrote, "You were the first person who ever truly heard me, and you never had to say a thing." He left the notebook open on the table. She saw it before she turned out the lamp, and when she came to bed that night, she curled beside him, warm and wordless, her breath steady against his neck. And in that silence, the deepest kind of answer bloomed. The days on the ranch settled into a rhythm marked not by hours but by gestures, glances, and the quiet hum of things done with care. After the dust of suspicion had blown past and the townsfolk turned their eyes elsewhere, Miriam's presence became as essential as water and sunlight. Caleb saw it in every corner of the land, from the way the chickens nested more contentedly under her hand, to the manner in which a limping sheep hobbled toward her without fear. She had something ancient in her bones, something unspoken that reached beneath skin and bone to the place where pain lived quiet and unannounced. She rarely used tinctures unless necessary. Instead, she used touch. A hand on a flank, a thumb pressed between the eyes of a restless dog, the warm weight of her palm on a feverish forehead. These were her medicines. People began to speak less of her strangeness and more of her gift. They came to the gate not with pitchforks but with questions. The cow won't feed her calf. The baby cries through the night. My husband hasn't spoken since the accident. She would go, nodding once, and return in the evening with hands tired but eyes calm. She never told Caleb what she said or did, but the animals stopped limping, and the babies slept. He'd watch her move through the barn as if born of its shadows, bending to lift a pail, brushing dust from a stall door. She knew when he'd forgotten to eat and placed bread beside him without making a sound. He began to catch her eyes in the soft moments between tasks. A look exchanged over steam rising from soup. A brief touch of her shoulder as he passed her in the doorway. They began to understand each other in the silences. A tap of her fingers meant she needed help lifting the hay bales. A tilt of her head meant the mare was laboring. A small smile without teeth meant the work was hard, but the day was good. In the evenings, after the sky had turned pale with stars, they sat on the porch without speaking. Sometimes he read aloud from books, unsure if she followed the words or simply listened to the music of his voice. Other times, they simply watched the wind move through the grasses and listened to the coyotes call in the distance. He wrote more now, not just in the notebook they shared, but on scraps of paper left around the house. Words she might find tucked in the folds of a dish towel or pinned behind the sugar jar. One read, "You move like the earth breathes." Another, "The house doesn't echo anymore." She never replied in writing, but sometimes the next morning she'd place a sprig of wild mint by his plate or leave his boots freshly oiled by the door. The first time he realized he missed her when she wasn't nearby, it struck him like a thunderclap in a blue sky. She had gone to tend a neighbor's sick horse and had been gone just past sunset. He paced the porch, though he told himself it wasn't worry. When she returned, hair wind-blown and sleeves dusted with hay, she offered him no explanation. She just stepped close and brushed her fingers briefly against his arm. That night, he found a note by his pillow that read, "He sleeps again." Caleb ran his fingers across the paper for a long time before tucking it into his shirt pocket. Their unspoken bond grew in the quiet acts of shared life. He carved her a box from cedar, lined it with soft cloth, and left it by her bed with no note. The next day, she filled it with feathers and leaves, things she found on the trail or beside the barn. She hung a strand of dried lavender above his chair. He built her a bench beneath the oak tree where she liked to watch the sky. It wasn't love in the loud way. There were no declarations, no flowers or dances, but it lived in every gesture, every still moment. Theirs was a language made not of words, but of presence. One autumn night, when the fire crackled low and the air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, Caleb reached for the notebook and turned to a fresh page. The lamp cast a golden glow across the table as he wrote, "I want to hear your heart if you'll let me listen with mine." He set the book beside her plate and stepped outside, the screen door clicking shut behind him. He didn't wait for her to read it. He didn't need to. He stood beneath the stars, letting the wind tug at his collar, letting his own words echo inside him. She joined him minutes later, the notebook pressed to her chest. She didn't speak. She simply stepped close and touched her fingers to his chest, then to her own, then opened her palm to the sky. He didn't understand the sign at first, but he felt it in the way her eyes softened, in the way her body leaned into his, not out of need but recognition. She was saying yes, not with lips, but with her whole being. After that night, something shifted. Their companionship, once born of necessity and maintained through respect, deepened into something sacred. They began to sign more deliberately, gestures they'd invented together, a tap for hunger, a curl of the hand for rest, a sweep of the thumb across the collarbone for beauty. Sometimes they just sat, hands moving in the air between them, a conversation carried by movement and memory. Caleb noticed how his own world had changed. He no longer waited for someone to fill the quiet. He no longer felt hollow in silence. The days were full, not of noise, but of meaning. They planted rows of squash and beans, built a new chicken coop, and painted the barn red for the first time in 20 years. At night, she would sometimes fall asleep on the porch, head resting against his shoulder, her breath steady. He never woke her, he just stayed, watching the stars shift above them. Years passed. They aged together, not in leaps, but in slow, certain turns. Her hair grew silver at the temples. His hands grew stiff in the mornings. But the house grew warmer with every season. It became a place people came to not for help, but for peace. Miriam never asked for thanks, never charged for what she did. People brought jars of jam, bolts of cloth, their thanks folded into gifts left at the gate. They all knew what she was now, not strange, not cursed, just someone who understood things beyond the surface. And Caleb, once a man of silence born from solitude, now cherished the quiet because it was shared. He learned to feel words instead of speak them. He learned that love didn't have to be declared to be felt. One winter morning, he left another note by her bowl of oats. "I don't miss sound when I'm near you." She smiled when she read it, then touched his cheek with the back of her fingers, a gesture they both knew meant "I'm home." The first time someone from town knocked on their door again. It wasn't with suspicion. It was a mother. Her boy had fallen from a horse and hadn't spoken since. She stood at the gate with her shawl pulled tight, eyes shifting nervously between the hills and the front porch. Caleb answered. Miriam stood just inside, wiping her hands on her apron. The mother didn't speak right away. She just held out a folded handkerchief and said, "They say she knows what hurts without being told." Caleb looked back at Miriam. She nodded, stepped forward, and took the cloth from the woman's hand. That boy was the first. He came with his mother the next day and sat stiffly in the chair by the fire. Miriam crouched before him, never touched him, just watched him breathe. She took his hand gently and placed it against her own chest, then against his. Then she stepped away. He cried that night. The kind of cry that comes from deep within, the kind that clears a path. By morning he was asking for biscuits. After that they came in a steady trickle. Children, widows, old ranchers whose bones ached when it rained. No one asked how she knew what to do. Miriam never spoke to them, not in words. But she listened in a way no one else could. She'd place a hand on a wrist or run her palm across a brow, and the person would soften like something inside had finally been seen. A rancher who hadn't slept since his wife died came just to sit in the quiet of her garden. A girl with a stutter found herself talking to the chickens while Miriam shelled peas beside her. The people who had once turned away in fear now began to turn toward her in hope. She never asked for payment. Sometimes they left jars of honey, a fresh pie, a bolt of cloth, sometimes just a thank you note on folded paper. Miriam kept everyone in a small wooden box by the hearth. She never opened it in front of anyone. But Caleb once saw her running her fingers along the edge of the lid after the house had gone quiet. Children adored her. They followed her around the ranch like ducklings, imitating her movements, trying to guess the meanings of her gestures. She taught them with patience, showing them how to read wind by the tilt of a leaf, how to soothe a dog with an open palm, how to speak without sound. They called her Miss Miriam, even though she never asked them to, and often just the heart lady. One child, a boy from the edge of town, once said, "She listens with everything." His mother cried when she heard that. She hadn't heard her son string together a sentence in weeks. Miriam never asked for acknowledgement, but word spread. One morning, a preacher who had once stood in a crowd that tried to drive her out arrived at the ranch with his hat in his hands. His wife had fallen ill and no doctor could figure why. He didn't beg. He just stood at the gate and waited. Miriam walked out, her boots dusted with straw, and looked at him without malice. He didn't speak. He only nodded once. She followed him home. And though no one ever said what happened inside that house, the woman was seen walking slowly through her garden again 2 weeks later, humming softly. That's when the town began to change. Not all at once, but in the slow, careful way people do when truth proves louder than fear. The same shopkeeper who once refused to look Miriam in the eye now kept a jar of her favorite dried apricots behind the counter. The boy who'd called her cursed offered to help stack firewood one fall morning. Even Thorne, proud and bitter as he was, sent over a sack of winter wheat without a note. Caleb found it on the porch and just shook his head with a small smile. The mayor, a gray-bearded man with hands like cracked leather, asked if she'd be willing to teach a few girls to care for animals. Miriam didn't answer, just looked at Caleb, who said she already has. Every Sunday, a small group gathered beneath the cottonwoods near the stream. Miriam taught them not just how to bind wounds or feed sick birds, but how to notice the world the way shadows move, the way sound bounces off bark, the way silence isn't empty but full of things waiting to be heard. Caleb watched all of it with a quiet pride. He never once tried to speak on her behalf. He never explained her or defended her again. She didn't need it. The town had learned what he had known from the start. She didn't need to be loud to be heard. One night, as they sat beneath the stars, he took her hand in his and said, "You've become the center of this whole place." She looked at him, tilted her head, and made the sign they'd made for joy, a small circle drawn over the heart. In time, she came to be called the girl who hears with her heart. The name started with a child and found its way into the mouths of elders and newcomers alike. It wasn't a title, she claimed. It was a truth they saw, and though she never spoke it, everyone who met her came to understand that she didn't need to. She became the one people turned to not just for healing but for stillness, a place to pause, a reminder of what it meant to be fully present with another. When storms came, folks asked if she felt them coming. When drought threatened, they trusted her to know when to plant. When grief settled on a home, she came with herbs, a warm hand, and nothing more than her presence. And that was always enough, Caleb once told her. Late in the winter after the first heavy snow, "You've turned this land into more than a ranch. It's become a place people come to remember how to breathe." She answered not with a gesture or a note, but with a soft kiss to his cheek, her fingers resting on his hand as if to say, "I know." And so the ranch remained what it always had been. But it held more now, a depth that stretched beyond fences and livestock. It became a refuge, a place where people found themselves again by watching someone who needed no words to show them who they were. The girl once called cursed now wore no labels, only grace. The silence that had once frightened so many now comforted them. And Miriam, without changing a thing about herself, became what every soul longs to find, a place where the world slows, where hearts are truly heard, and where healing begins not through noise, but through presence, and love that asks nothing but to be felt. The seasons passed gently on the ranch, as if time itself had learned to move more slowly in their company. Years slipped by, marked not by grand events but by the quiet changes that came with shared life. The porch steps wore soft from familiar boots. The edges of Miriam's apron faded from sun and washing. Caleb's hands grew more weathered, his shoulders more stooped, but his gaze never lost the steady warmth he carried when she entered the room. They did not speak of age, nor of the way their limbs stiffened more with each winter. They moved through life like two trees grown close together, leaning just enough to shield one another from the wind. Their mornings were still filled with chores, though the pace had slowed. Caleb tended to the smaller tasks now, mending hinges, gathering eggs, checking fences with short walks and longer rests. Miriam, though her hair had turned nearly white, continued to move through the garden with her same grace. She knelt slowly now, but her hands never faltered. She still sang in the way only she could, not with sound but with motion, the rhythm of her hands slicing herbs, the arc of her arm as she scattered seed, the nod she gave to each bird who dared come close. Caleb often watched her from the window, holding his mug in both hands, wondering how it was that silence between them had never felt like absence. The house bore the signs of their life together. The notebook they once used to write messages now lived on the mantel, filled with pages and pages of a life built word by word. There were grocery lists, yes, and notes about animals. But between those were love letters disguised as everyday conversation. Roof leaks by the east corner written in Caleb's hand had been answered with, "I'll patch it if you sit with me after." Out of time had once followed a small dried sprig placed on top, tied with twine and left beside his tea. These were their conversations, unassuming and yet full of devotion. Visitors still came now and then, though fewer than before. Those who did came not with urgency, but with reverence. Like entering a chapel, they came to sit in the quiet, to walk the rows of herbs Miriam kept growing, or to bring gifts of preserves and firewood. One boy, no longer a boy, once returned to bring his own child. He sat the toddler on Miriam's lap and said simply, "I wanted him to meet the woman who helped raise my heart." Miriam touched the boy's hand, then the child's, then smiled in that way that always made the air feel warmer. Their love had never needed words. It showed in the way she poured his tea without asking, knowing just how he liked it, barely sweet, never too hot. In the way he pulled her chair close to the stove before she could reach for her shawl. In the way they paused when passing each other in doorways, leaning just slightly into the other's presence before continuing on. They had no pet names, no rehearsed phrases. They didn't exchange gifts on anniversaries or recount the day they met. Instead, their love existed in the rhythm of days, a steady, quiet pulse that never wavered. Sometimes, in the stillness of dusk, Caleb would reach for her hand, not needing to say anything. She would lace her fingers through his and rest their hands on her lap, and they'd watch the sky melt from blue to gold together. Other times, when the wind howled and the windows rattled, they sat close on the couch, wrapped in the same quilt, listening to the storm like an old lullaby. They had heard so many of them now, and each one had passed. Like all things, Caleb often thought about how much of their life together had been lived without fanfare. No great declarations, no letters sent to distant relatives, just the two of them, here, tending to each other and to the land. It was enough. It had always been enough. And yet, sometimes at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would take down the notebook and write one more line. Not because she needed to read it, but because he needed to say it somewhere. "You are the only sound I've ever missed when it's gone." He never read those lines aloud. He didn't have to. In the mornings, when she noticed the page turned, she'd kiss the back of his hand before pouring the coffee. That was her answer. As the years grew longer behind them than ahead, they began to move with more care, as if the earth itself had asked them to slow and notice. Caleb no longer rode the fence line but walked it, one post at a time, sometimes with Miriam by his side, sometimes alone with her waiting near the gate. She no longer weeded every row, but she spent hours among her plants, running her fingers along the stems like greeting old friends. They found joy in smaller things, a fresh loaf cooling on the sill, a crow building its nest under the eaves, the way the first snowfall laid a hush across the fields. One evening, as the light faded and the shadows lengthened, they sat on the porch wrapped in their quilt. Miriam's head rested on Caleb's shoulder, her breath soft and even. He looked out across the land at the hills bathed in golden light, at the barn weathered but still standing, at the garden that would soon sleep under frost. He didn't feel regret. He didn't feel fear, just a deep, full quiet. He turned to her, pressed a kiss to her hair, and whispered the only words he knew to speak aloud. "Thank you." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her fingers found his, and they held hands as the stars appeared one by one. Later, when someone from town asked Caleb what it was like to love someone who never spoke, he just smiled and said, "Sometimes the truest love is not the one shouted from rooftops, but the kind that walks beside you in silence every day." And when he said it, he didn't look up or out or away. He looked at the empty chair beside him, where a shawl still hung across the back, and smiled, because even then, even in her absence, he heard her presence like a melody only he had ever known. In the quiet story of Miriam and Caleb, we're reminded that love doesn't always need to be loud to be real. It lives in the quiet gestures: a shared cup of tea, a hand held during storms, the warmth of someone who simply stays. As we grow older, many of us realize that the most lasting bonds are not built on grand declarations but on trust, presence, and care shown over time. This story speaks to a deeper truth many seniors know in their hearts: that companionship is less about words and more about understanding. Whether it's the quiet presence of a spouse, the loyal routine of a friend, or the silent comfort of a pet, we find meaning in those who choose to walk beside us without needing to speak. In a world that often values noise and speed, this tale reminds us that stillness has power, and that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from answers, but from being truly seen and deeply accepted. For those in their golden years, it's a gentle affirmation: you don't have to say much to matter. You just have to show up, stay kind, and listen with your heart.